This is a production of Cornell University.
Before I'm going to discuss about the topic today, which is the models that we are planning to study during this semester, it's called the CGE, Computable General Equilibrium. Let me give a background why economists, planners, and so on started to use the CGE. In fact, the CGE became very popular in the 70s. So, if you think about scientific method, 70s, that was not long time ago, usually many of the theories, models has been there for decades, but this is only in the 70s. So let me give you some backgrounds why, two things, why people started to use CGE, and second is why people move from the general equilibrium models like SAM, which you all familiar with, into CGE. Okay? So let me start with the second one. All right, what do we learn from the SAM, from the social accounting matrix? Basically, we learn that we can capture the interaction among institution, production sectors, and factors, right? And we found that it is very useful because we are not only capturing the direct effect and the interactions, direct interactions, but also we are able to capture the indirect effect, the feedback effect, and so on, right? And I've shown in class that you can apply that techniques of the social accounting matrix into both national or regional as well as international and interregional. And I give an example of some interregional SAM and so forth. And then last week, I argued that, well, but the SAM multipliers are not really that everything because yes, it gives you some information in terms of what is the power of one shock in one sector into the rest of the economy, yes, but basically it's almost like a black box. It doesn't tell you what is going on in the process, right? And yet if you're sitting as a planner or sitting as a policymaker, that's not enough information for you to take an action. In order to take an action, it's not only information that you know which sector or which policy shocks that you have to take, but also how that policy shock will transmit into whatever your intended outcome, whether reducing the poverty, improving the income distribution, maximizing the growth, and so forth. All right, and that's why we moved to a model which is called the structural path analysis (SPA). And what SPA does basically is to give you the transmission mechanisms from one shock to another shock to another shock until it hits your final nodes, what they call the nodes. Okay, that's your variables that you are interested in. And the best example to show in that kind of a model is that what happened if you, for example, Tompkins County decided to, for example, build a new public infrastructure, and you would like to know who among the society in Tompkins County will be most affected by that kind of public infrastructure. So that is one way that SPA can do, all right? You can trace from that particular infrastructure project into the factors of productions, because when you build that project, you hire workers, you need capital. So there's incomes generated through the factors of productions, and then those income translated into income of the different households, the rich, the poor, the medium income, and so forth, right? All right, so you're happy with that, right? Because you're now empowered as a planner. Now you're able not only to identify which sector is the most powerful, but you're also able to identify how the transmission mechanism works. But there's one thing that is missing, a big thing that is missing here. Up to last week, you are all assuming that if there is a shock in one sector, and then there's an effect on another sectors, you are all assuming that yes, the effect is taking place in terms of income, in terms of output, but nothing happened with the price. Now tell me if that is not unrealistic. But what surprised me is none of you raised that question during the last 2-3 weeks when we started to talk about SAM. Okay? What happened with the price? Think about this. Suppose the New York State government decided to let's say, reduce the tax, okay, for whatever purpose. Now, you know, let's assume you don't know anything about CGE model and you only know about SAM. You know what happens if tax is reduced. Well, you expect that the consumption of certain products will increase, right? Because if you reduce the tax, you know that the price is indirectly also be reduced. Or at least you don't have to pay tax, sales tax, let's say. So you know that consumptions will go up. And you also know that which consumptions will go up depending on what kind of tax that is cut off, right? But think about this. If the tax is reduced, what happened with the income of the New York State government? It will decrease, right? Where in the SAM or in SPA you can capture that? And yet the effect on the decline of the income of the New York State government has a major ramifications on the New York State infrastructure development. Maybe there will be more potholes, there is no improvement in the sewage system and so forth, because now they have less income, right? Now, also think about this. If people buying more, thanks to the tax reduction, okay, now they have more goods, right? But who are these people? They are not necessarily only consumers. They can be also producers who buy things and then sell again, right? Now, what do you think will happen with the price if someone buy the commodities thanks to the tax cut and then they're selling again? What kind of price that these people will sell? At what price they're going to sell? Higher, lower, or the same? See? And if that is higher, there is impact on the consumers who are buying the products sold by the first customers who buy more goods because of the tax cut, right? So you see the impact here? Let me give you one more example before I move on. You know, several years ago, there was an embargo. Things about two countries, country A and country B. Let's say country A decided to impose an embargo on certain products. Let's say oil, okay, oil embargo. Now, you know what happened with the price of oil, right? That will go up, right? Now, what is your choice if you just know social contact matrix and SPA? What is your choice? Suppose now there is another country impose an embargo on oil. The price of oil will go up. What is your choice here? What happened with the price in your country? Increase. Well, let's assume that most of your activities domestically use oil, and let's assume that 50% of the oil is imported, right? So you have many choices here. One choice is, well, you let the price decided by the market, meaning that you let the price goes up, which means inflation goes up, or you start to find a substitution, right? Why don't we try to find oil from other sources? Or you can also increase your domestic production of oil, right? So every single response that you are taking will have an impact on the domestic price of oil, right? Just because of the act of another country's policies, correct? So if the price domestically changes because of whatever your decision is, that will also generate, you know, all kinds of changes in the domestic economy. Think about this, because oil is basically intermediate goods, right? It's input. It's not output. No one really consumes oil directly, but it's used for production and so forth, right? So the price of the final products that use oil will definitely go up, right? You know, for example, in the US, the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, they're not looking at the CPI including oil and food actually, because the CPI that they're looking at is only the prices outside food and energy. That means what happened to the price of oil, it's not going to be reflected in the CPI that Ben Bernanke is looking at. But that is very narrow-minded kind of an opinion. If you think that the price of oil will have no ramifications on the CPI in the US, right? Because yes, the CPI, which they call the core inflation, yes, the core inflation may not include the price of energy, may not include the price of food. But as the price of energy goes up, the price of everything else will go up. And eventually the core inflation will also go up, right? So think about that. Now, when I started to talk about the intermediate in goods like oil, for example, what do you think? What kind of model you're thinking? The moment I talk about intermediate inputs, that's input-output, right? Remember, what is an input-output here? This is the value added. This is the total input. This is the final demand. And this is the total output. So what is this? This is the intermediate input, right? But in the input-output, we only know which sector use oil, okay, and how much. That's all we know. But we don't know what is the effect of the change in the price of oil, right? For example, let's say there are 10 sectors, sector number 1 until sector number 10. You don't know which sector, which number of sectors that will react more when there is a change in the price of oil, and which sector will react less. React more means, if the price of oil goes up, then the elasticity of the price is also high, so meaning that the price of that commodity also go up. But maybe there are some sectors which is not so much oil dependent, so that they are less sensitive to the price of oil, right? So, do you have some ideas about why the change in price is important in the real world? That's my purpose actually, the first few minutes here, trying to give you an idea why prices are so important here. Now, in the modeling term, what we need to do now is to endogenize prices. Because in the SAM, in the input-output, in the SPA, prices are treated as exogenous variables. And now we need to endogenize that variables. The next point that I'm going to talk is really very fundamental in modeling, planning model, forecasting model, in any modeling, okay? Let's say people would let's go back to the story about the price of oil. The current price of oil started to increase when? It's in fall 2004, right? And the difference between the high price of oil now and in the 70s, anybody knows what's the difference? In the 70s, the price of oil went up because of the war. That was the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. And then the price of oil quadrupled, right? And then there was another one in 1980. In 1979, price of oil went up again. Why? It was because of the war again. But at that time, the war was Iran-Iraq war. But the current price of oil increase, which started in fall 2004, had nothing to do with the war. So what was the difference between the price of oil now and then in the 70s?
Supply?
No. It's the strong demand, thanks to the robust economic growth, especially countries like India, China, including the US. Remember, maybe you're now easily influenced by the current news that the US economy is slowing down. No, up to 2005, 2006, it's still growing robustly in the US. So because of strong growth in the world, the demand for oil also goes up. Nothing to do, very little to do with the supply side of the oil. But because of the strong demand, price went up. Okay? Now, think about this. Suppose you were hired by a country or a state government trying to see what is the impact of the high price of oil on our economy, let's say. Many people, not all, but many people, what they do is they look at, okay, before the price of oil went up, what happened with the economy? You collect data, you do all kind of statistical analysis, and then you get a picture. Let's call it picture A. And then you collect the data after the price of oil. Again, you apply all kind of statistical analysis. You get a picture. Let's call it B. And then you compare A and B. Now, B is the results of the increase of the price of oil. You present it to your client. You got your money, you're happy, the client is happy. Unfortunately, methodologically that is completely wrong. Why? Anybody knows why? Why that is wrong to see the impact of an event, in this case the event I'm referring to the price of oil increase, by looking at what happened before and after.
Because everything else changes too?
Exactly. How can you assume that everything else is the same except the price of oil changes? Remember, we are still in social science, so we are still dealing with the behavior of the human being, economic agents, social agents, right? So the behavior of economic agents responding to whatever changes, and the changes are plenty. It's not only the price of oil. So methodologically, you cannot use before and after. This is wrong. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, too many analyses I've seen is really based on before and after. Why? Because it's easy. Just collect the data before the event and then collect the data after the event, and that's what you conclude. Aha, the event caused such and such. What we need to do is with and without. What happened if there was price of oil increase? That's the with, right? And what happened if the price of oil does not increase? That's the without. And then you compare the two. That is the methodologically desirable approach. Okay? Now, it's easy to say, but the question is how you do that. Remember, this is social science. If it is chemistry or physics, maybe we can do it quite easily. We just go to the lab and then we mix substance A and substance B. With substance B, let's see what happened. Okay? And then without substance B, let's see what happened, and then you compare that. But in a society, how do you do that? In socio-economic life, how do you do that? We don't have laboratorium, right? So, this is really the reason why economists and other social scientists learn how to make a model, because the laboratorium that we are referring to is a model here, and the SAM, SPA and CGE that we are going to discuss today, that is an example of the model. Because once you have the model, you satisfied with the model, of course we have to check to test everything like the statistical properties of the model, but once we are happy with the models, that will become our lab. And then we play around with that model. Suppose there is price of oil increase, shock that model and see the results. And then you compare. Suppose there is no increase in price of oil, shock the model, you get the result, and then you compare the two. Is that clear? This is very fundamental. But again, as I said, there are too many analyses. It's only looking at before and after. And the answer, if you ask me why, the answer is very simple, because it's easy. Okay, it's easy. You don't need to do a model. Building model is very difficult. It's time consuming, difficult, expensive, right? So why do you have to go through that kind of ordeal if you can do it just simply by looking at what happened before and then what happened after? Remember, was it last week or 2 weeks ago when I mentioned about Cornell is interested to see what's the impact of Cornell University in the surrounding area? Now, if one do not understand model, they can just collect the data, right? Let's say before a new program introduced by Cornell, what happened in the community? And then after the program, what happened with the community? They can do that. But specifically the requests that came to us, specifically asking apply such and such model. I don't have to mention the name of the model, but such and such model. Okay. Why? Because precisely they don't want to look at the before and after. What they are interested to see is what is really the effect of this program on the community by looking at with and without the program. Okay? Now, this before and after and with and without, sometimes it's called broken window effect. The reason why they call it broken window effect is because the story is that there's a baseball players and then they throw the baseball and then hits windows and then the window is broken. Now, if people just look at before and after, they will see, aha, if the window is broken, then the owner of the house will need to go to a window store to replace that. That means it generates the income of the window store, right? So that's good for the economy, because before and after, that's the case, right? But compare with and without, because yes, there is some group of people that was disbenefited by that, but there are also some people benefited by the broken of the windows, right? And I guess that's the reason why they call it broken window effect. But forget about the name. What is important is you understand the difference between before and after and with and without. And let me repeat, I hope you remember the rest of your life. With and without is the most reliable methodology if you are asked to do the impact analysis. Okay? Now, that's the first part. Why prices are so important and why before and after and with and without is important. Now, the next point is about the CGE itself, which is our topic today, the computable general equilibrium. From the name you can suggest, computable. Why computable? Are there other things which is not computable? Why they call it computable general equilibrium? Well, let's look at the GE first, the general equilibrium, the second part. I'm assuming most of you had in one way or another some economics before, right? So most of you knows what is general equilibrium compared to the partial equilibrium. So basically, general equilibrium is a theory, an economic theory that try to see the overall impact. Sometimes people call it the economy-wide impact of a particular shock, whereas partial equilibrium is only looking at partially, so the impact on consumer A or consumer B and so forth. Whereas in general equilibrium, you look at the entire economy effect. Okay? So why it's called computable general equilibrium? Well, actually, the theory of general equilibrium dated back in Walras. So it's already been there for decades. Okay? But why only in the 70s people started to use computable general equilibrium? Well, there are two reasons. The main reason why people started to use computable general equilibrium in the 70s is thanks to technology, and that is computer. Because before the 70s, economists knows how to build, sophisticated, comprehensive models and so forth. But the problem is they're stuck with proving it numerically. Why? Because it's so big. Remember, we are not dealing with a series of data like in econometrics. We are dealing with matrix, right? Remember when I said, when you deal with n by n dimension of data, you cannot simply change one number. Because if you change one number, you have to rearrange the whole matrix, which is very different from time series data. In time series data, if you know, data from quarter 3 is wrong, you can change that, and without changing the whole system. All right? Now, if you're dealing with 150 by 150 sectors, how many numbers are there, right? And what is human capacity to think about all these numbers, to analyze? Even if they're able to solve numerically, let's say it takes, maybe in the 70s it takes 3 months, okay, to solve all this combination. How can they analyze that? It's just too tedious, too complex, all right? Now, in the 70s, technology came up with high-speed computer. Do you remember 70s? What is the fastest processor there? There is no Pentium yet, right, in the 70s. There is no Pentium. Say it again? It could be, yeah. Maybe this tiny thing requires the whole room, maybe, right, to do all these calculations here. So, economists, in a way, are helped by engineers or by computer scientists, because now they are able to solve big models consisting of a lot of numbers using the machine, right? And once you're able to do that, you can always make some adjustment more easily. I remember during my student days, I used this machine that has to give the sound cling, that means correct, right? But can you imagine if there are 50 students in the room, cling, hey, is that my machine or my next door machine? I don't know, right? So you have to do all the... So if you made a mistake, you have to do all over again, and we are dealing with a lot of numbers, so that's difficult. Now we have machine and so forth. Now, that's the engineers, right? The engineers found all those high-speed machine and so on. But thank also to computer scientists. Computer scientists who collaborate with economists, they build software. What is the purpose of high-speed machine if there is no software? How can you analyze the structural path analysis, the last week exercise, if I don't give you maths? Well, then you will say, oh, I can do it through Excel and so on. Yeah, how long it will take, right? So, both the hardware and the software. So, in the 70s, there are more and more economic modeling softwares came up in the market. And that helps the modelers to, improve the quality of their models, the properties of the models, drop some assumptions and so forth. Anyway, in short, that was really the short explanations why computable general equilibrium started in the 70s. Okay, that's why it's computable. Before that, economists from Leon Walras, they started to draw, charts and then curve, graph, and then some equation, mathematical equation, and then they prove the existence or the uniqueness of the solution of general equilibrium. In fact, if you look at the list of Nobel Prize winners in the 70s, almost all of them got Nobel Prize because working in the general equilibrium models. Gerard de Broglie, all those guys actually, they're all working in general equilibrium kind of a models, right? But without numerical examples, because they couldn't do it. There was no machine there, right? But the general equilibrium theory is already there. Now, thanks to all these computers, the software and so forth, in the 70s they started to use computable general equilibrium. That's why they call it CGE. All right? Now, do you remember when I talk about planning model and forecasting model? All right, what's the difference between forecasting model and planning model? Nits.
In planning model, the policy is
This is the easy way to think. Suppose tomorrow you're hired by the planning office in Ithaca, in Tompkins County. What is your main task there as a planner?
recommend a model, a policy.
All right, so what does it mean in terms of the status of the policy variables?
It's exogenous. Endogenous.
You recommend, right? If you recommend, that means you have to work on it. If it is exogenous, that means you're not working, you're just collecting data and then you give it to your client, right? So policy variables are endogenous in the planning models, right? So I hope from today until the end of the semester you remember this. Why? Because from today, from now on, we are always treating policy variables as endogenous variables. Meaning, whatever we are doing, all math that we are going to deal with, all will end up with searching for endogenous variables, for the policy variables, okay? Now, I have a problem a little bit in this class in terms of teaching this. Well, let me mention the first problem, and this is a very serious problem, and that is, I just told you, right, the 70s, why people started to work on computable general equilibrium, thanks to the computer and the software. Now, the computer we had no problem because Gaddis lab had relatively fast machine, right? The software, we have the software there, but software is a software. Remember, software was not built by economists. It's not made by economists. Software made by computer scientists. So they don't know about economics, the software, right? You have to use the software. You have to put economic models into the software, right? That means you have to understand the language of the software, and the software called GAMS. So the bad news is you have to learn the language of GAMS. We had the software in the lab, but you have to learn the language of the software. Okay. Now, if I look at the course outline, we have something like 8 meetings for the CGE. Okay, 8 meetings. So what I'm trying to do here is that I will give the concept and examples how the CGE model can solve particular issues. Okay, and then during the lab, I hope you're all active in learning the language of GAMS. In particular, learning how to use the software to solve particular problems. Okay, because I don't think I have enough time during the 8 meetings, the next 8 weeks, to explain from the beginning, about the language of GAMS. Now, some of you may argue, do we really need to use GAMS? No, you don't need GAMS because there are several, maybe 15, 20 softwares available in the market. And I'm not even ready to say GAMS is the best software. By the way, I don't have any share in this company, okay? So I'm not promoting anything. The only reason is very simple, because I'm used to it. Okay? So unfortunately, this is the unfairness in the part of the professors, because I'm used to using this. But if you're familiar with using another software, feel free to use that. Because the most important is not so much the software or the mathematics, the most important is the planning analysis, okay, how to interpret the results and so forth. All right. So what I'm planning to do today is to give you 2 examples. One is how to build a CGE, very simple CGE, okay, just 2 sectors model. As a matter of fact, if you look at the course outline, you can learn this first model that I'm going to explain today from one of the reading materials. That's the small book, actually. Anybody brings the course outline here? Everything is there, okay? So what I'm going to explain today is how using, okay, here, let me show you the book. Okay, it's in page 4. Okay, the title is the 2-sector general equilibrium model. It's written by Dinwiddie and Thiel. It's 1988 books, actually. Okay. So the model that I'm going to explain, the first model I'm going to explain today, is from that book. Now, what is interesting is that if you read that book, the example is simple, and even the software, how to program that into numerical example, it's also simple, because the book was written in the 88. The GAMS was there already, but it was so difficult at that time. So the author used simple, basic language. Do you remember there was a basic language, computer language? Yeah. Very basic. So they use basic. So please, if you have a chance, look at the book. It's all basic. Okay. But of course, in this class, what I'm going to do is to give you the same example, but how it is written in GAMS. Because I don't think you're interested to learn basic language, right? I don't think it's used any longer, right? All right. So let me give you the example about this model. Before I move on, I forgot there's one other concept very critical in CGE, and that is called the Walras law. Okay. Basically, the Walras law says that if you have, let's say, m-1 markets, because remember, in CGE, we are dealing with a large number of commodities, right? So if you have m-1 markets, and that m-1 markets are in equilibrium, which I'm going to explain in a few minutes, then the mth market, so the market number m, will be also in equilibrium. That is called the Walras law. So let's say you have 10 markets, okay? 10 commodity markets. if the 9 commodity markets are in equilibrium, then the 10th one will be also in equilibrium. That's the Walras law. Now, now if you hear about this, you might think, so what? It's very automatic, right? Well, but when you started to work on the software, on the programming, then you will notice the beauty of this Walras law. I mean, it's really nice because you can check whether you made a mistake or not by adopting the Walras law. Because, this is another caution, early caution. I'm sure there will be a lot of cautions toward the next few weeks. But the first caution here is this. Even if you work on CGE programming, even if your models, your program give the solution, even if the software gives you optimal solution found, and then you got the result, there is no guarantee that you're right. That's the caution here. Okay? In a way, it's bad news, right? Of course, in many cases, when you made a mistake in the programming, it doesn't give you results. It tells you non-optimal solution, or there's errors or something like that. But if that is the case, it's easy. At least you can identify immediately, okay, I made a mistake. But in some cases, you run the model, it tells you optimal solution is found, but your model is wrong. So in order to avoid that kind of scenario, you can use Walras law. You can check with the Walras law whether your model is right or not. Okay? All right, so let me give you an example of the model. Okay, this is very simple. Okay. Oh, but we cannot turn off the light, right? All right. Basically, this is the simple two-sector model. So in economy, there are two sectors. Okay, let's call it sector 1 and sector 2. Let me write down first the consumption here. Okay. What do you start in microeconomics when you enter the first day of courses on microeconomics? Consumers' behavior, right? You have to understand how consumers behave. So let's say C1, C2. So in other words, the utility of the consumers depends on how much they can consume commodity 1 and how much they can consume commodity 2. Okay? Now, if you see this kind of a function, you know what form is this. This is simple form of Cobb-Douglas. Now, does anybody remember 0.5, 0.5? What does that mean? What kind of technology is this? Constant returns to scale. Okay? CRS. Because the summation of the powers is exactly equals to 1. If the summation is less than 1, it's decreasing returns to scale. If it is greater than 1, it's increasing return to scale. Okay? Now, what do you want to do with the utility in consumers' behavior theory? Minimize or maximize? Of course you want to maximize. Everybody wants to maximize their happiness, right? Let's say if I'm drawing this, and this is utility. So this is my utility functions, okay? You tell me when to stop, okay? Shall I continue? Okay. Still? Still. Still? Still? Can I borrow a chair? So when do I stop then? You're telling me to maximize this. This is not maximize. I still continue, right? Unlimited, right? So this is absurd. This is unrealistic, right? What is more realistic? You want to maximize your need, your utility, subject to what? Your budget. Subject to your budget. Let's call your income INC. That's for income. And then let's assign P1 for the price of commodity 1 and then P2 for the price of commodity 2. All right? Now, notice, we have a new friends now. Who are these? Price. Up to last week, no price. We didn't deal with price. But today, we are dealing with price here. Okay? All right. Everybody expert how to solve the first order conditions, right? Okay, for those who are not, let's say C1, C2, INC minus P1, C1 minus P2, C2, right? So what's the C1 here? 0.5, C1 0.5, C2 0.5 plus, minus lambda P1, right? dl over dc2 0.5, C1 0.5, C2 0.5 minus lambda P2, and this has to be equals to 0, right? And then the last one is lambda equals to INC minus P1 C1 minus P2 C2 equals to 0, right? This is very basic. It's 101, okay? Now, this is what we want to maximize now, the utility. But what we want to know is, what is the behavior of the price? What should be the price in order for me to maximize the utility? Well, let's see. There is a price here, there is a price here. Aha, I have some relation here. I can write, okay, let's see. P1 over P2, right? You can cross this, C2 over C1. Very simple, right? Now, and then you can substitute here, let's say, C1 equals to INC minus P2 C2 over P1, right? From this constraint. Do you get it? And then you substitute it here, and what you get is that. That is C1 equals to Y over 2, INC over 2 P1, and then C2 equals to INC over 2 P2. Okay? You don't need to really trying to understand now. You can do it later after the class or at home and so on. But believe me, this is very simple, straightforward. 101. Now, what is important for you to understand here is that when you're sitting in Gaddis lab, when you're starting to build a model, okay, programming in your computer for CGE, when you use GAMS, you don't ask GAMS to solve the optimization. You don't. Even though GAMS can do it, but you don't do that. So what do? What you do is you insert the results of the optimization into the GAMS. Because this formula is derived from optimization, right? So in other words, you don't put constraint in the GAMS, but you put the optimum results, because this is optimum results of the consumption commodity 1 and consumption commodity 2, right? That's why you put it there. Now, this is very basic. Number one, you have to know how the consumers behave. And this is the answer to the questions how. Okay? Consumers wants to maximize their utility subject to their income. Okay? What is the next step? Of course, after we deal with consumers, we have to deal with producers, right? But the problem with producers, unlike consumers, they are facing two types of optimization. The number one optimization that they are facing is that how can I, as a producer, decide how much inputs I'm going to use, how much labor I'm going to hire, how much capital I need for my operation and so forth. That's the first optimization that I have to face. But that's not the end. Producers have to face another optimization question, and that is how much output I'm going to produce. You see what I mean? How much output? So for the first challenge, how much inputs I'm going to use, of course, what I have in mind is I want to minimize my costs, right? That's what I want, minimize my costs. So I want to minimize, this is producers, okay? And this is consumers. And as I said, the first one is minimize the total cost, which is total revenue, total cost, which is P1, WL, okay, W is the wage rate, the wages, L is the labor, plus R is the returns on capital, and K is the capital. This is what I want to minimize. Is that clear? Now, what is the constraint here? Because if I minimize this, I can draw the same thing but going down and never stop, right? There has to be constraint. Subject to production function, because production function is the technology that I'm facing, whatever technology I have, right? So, let's use the simple production function, and that is Cobb-Douglas. Let's say K alpha L minus alpha. I think in the example, I forgot what number I used for alpha. No, in the example. Well, it doesn't matter because you can put any numbers here. If this is 0.3, that means this is 0.7. If this is 0.4, this is 0.6. Okay, it doesn't matter. All right. So what you do is you have to solve this optimization. Again, you take same techniques here. So WL plus RK minus lambda y minus K alpha L1 minus alpha. Okay, and then take the first order condition and so forth. Okay, and when you take the optimizations, the results what you get is exactly the same like this. Let me see here. Here, this is K, okay, the formula of K, and this is L. Because from this system what you get is the optimum of L and the optimum of K. Is that clear? Again, when you're sitting in front of your computer, do you ask GAMS to solve this? No. What you have to do is plug in that equation, because that equation is already the results of the optimization. Is that clear? Okay. Now, why there are two Ks and there are two Ls? Because there are two commodities. Remember, two sectors model, commodity 1 and commodity 2. Okay. So that's the first optimization problems faced by the producers. The second, remember, producers have to decide also what is the best level of output for me to produce. Because if you look at here, basically the question is focusing only on K and L, which is your inputs, capital and labor. But the next optimization challenge is that, all right, how much I have to produce? That depends on what? Profit. You want to minimize or maximize profit? You want to maximize profit. So maximize profit. What is profit? Total revenue minus total cost. What is your total revenue? Say it again. Okay, what is the output here? That's the demand. So what is it? What is the output? What is my total revenue here? Yeah, what is the quantity here? Y. But this is in unit. What about in dollar terms? What is total cost? That is your optimization, right? And again, you take the Lagrange, you take the first order conditions, you get the optimization, and the result is this. Okay? What do you have to put in the software? Not ordering the GAMs to do the optimization. You plug in the results of this optimization. Okay? So, you know the behavior of the consumers now, and you know the behavior of the producers. What do you do next?
Find equilibrium.
What's your next job?
Find equilibrium.
Yeah, that means you have to become a matchmaker now, right?
Yeah.
Your producer.
Market.
Let the producer meet with the consumers. Where do they meet?
Market.
In the market. But the concept of market is not necessarily going to the mall and then meet. No, but market means, you know, whatever the producer offer and then what consumers demand, right? So, let them meet with these consumers. And when they meet, what happened there? What happened in the meeting, in the marriage? What happened there?
They exchange or
Yeah, exchange, but how do you decide before you come to the final conclusion, okay, let's exchange? What happened there? You're a producer, I'm consumer, and we meet somewhere, or we don't have to meet physically, maybe through telephone or whatever. But before I decided to, yes, I'm going to sell, and you said, yes, I'm going to buy, what happens there? Negotiations, right? I want price this, I want price that, and finally after you agree, you meet there. So, what does that mean? What happened with the price there? Boop, 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 boop. Endogenously determined, right, in the market. That is the main characteristic of CGE. Prices are determined endogenously. By whom? By the market. Yes?
Quick question, one of the most growth models today is like talk about technological changes being the residual and more recently human capital as being like the most important factor for growth in developed countries.
Yeah.
How do you endogenize these factors like in new models?
Yeah, that's a good one because there's a new endogenous growth model, okay? What Marshall was asking is that let's look at labor here. Labor here is just one number, right? L, it's only one. But there are tens of different types of labor, skilled labor, unskilled labor, semi-skilled labor, okay? Or sometimes people use high school graduated labor, university or college graduate and things like that. So all kinds of different. Now, how do you distinguish that? If you have that information, you can split this into L beta, L2 gamma, L3 delta, and so on and so forth, depending on the availability of your data. Now, how each of the different skills of labor affects the output here, because we have to distinguish, right? The productivity of the skilled labor is higher than the productivity of the unskilled labor, okay? How do you distinguish that power? So if L1 is high skilled labor, then beta will be different than delta here if the L3 is unskilled labor. So that's how you distinguish that. Now, but there is still a next question. Here, if you look at this equation, basically what we are saying is that whatever happened with the inputs, in this case capital and labor, that will determine the output. But in the endogenous models here, the output can also determine this. So you have this circularity here, right? That's number one problem. Sometimes some economists said, well, but there are also other factors which is nothing to do with KL, but it can contribute to the output. So the story is this. If I have 5 people working for my companies and I produce 100 units, I can make employing the same 5 people, but I can produce 150 units. You see what I mean? So in other words, there is something else, has nothing to do with these inputs, that makes me able to produce more. So something else sometimes put A in front of it. That's called the technical coefficient. For example, Marshall, you have a company with 5 people working. I have the same company doing in similar operation. I have also 5 people. But guess what? I manage my employee in such that they're highly productive. But the way you manage, for example, you don't care about whatever your employee is doing and so forth. The same 5 people, the same skill, okay? And we are operating in the same kind of a business, but I can be much more productive. Let's say in each room of each of the employee, I play nice music. I believe that music raises your productivity. If you don't believe, that's fine, but that's fine. Or you make your room very green, okay, with some flowers and so. I also believe that, okay, but you don't believe that. That's fine, okay. So there are other factors. So once you input into A, your output can be different. That's what the dynamics of the model that you're referring to, right? So you can always you can always do that.
Do these models affect? I know also for a fact that like capital is like now that model of production is like assumes perfect competition, and most models today work with like monopolistic competition.
Yeah.
So you have to account for increasing returns to scale
Correct.
in almost every industry. Do new CGE models reflect that reality?
Absolutely, absolutely. From a couple of seconds, your statement just now, I immediately capture two different things. One is you're talking about non-constant returns to scale, right? You're talking about increasing return. That can be captured through this power, basically. As long as the summation of this power is greater than 1, you are in the world of increasing return to scale. That's number one. But you are also touching something else, I noticed that. And that is, how can you capture, for example, the dynamics of this K and L? Am I capturing right your point that you want to know what is the dynamics of each of these inputs, right?
No, the models like the models of monopolistic competition.
Ah, okay.
No,
Got it. The monopolistic competition. Yes. Now, what is the difference between perfect competition and monopolistic competition? What's the first thing that you know immediately different between the two? Price. Why?
In competitive form, is price that price is given. Usually price is given, but in monopolistic, is price is determined.
No. Remember, we are in the world of endogenous price. No price is given here. It's all have to be determined by the system, endogenous. So that's not the answer. Why?
yeah.
In competitive market, the price is the equilibrium price.
No, even in monopolistic competition, it's still determined by the market. But okay, first of all, the price in the monopolistic competition is different than the price in perfect competition. You know that, right? But the question is why?
The demand of the monopoly faces down. The demand as a function of the price.
No?
The reality is like monopolistic competition, like in a perfect competition model, price is the only determinant on what company gets ahead or not. Like monopolistic competition, it's not only price. Like advertising, branding, a good name, a company can get ahead of another company even though it's the same product and the same price. So it can get increasing returns to scale based on something more than just the price of the product.
So, whatever you're saying, you're implying something which you don't spell it out, and that is the cost, right? Why I can impose higher price, or which is called the monopolistic competition price, than he cannot. He impose lower price, which is the perfect competition price. Why I can impose higher? Because I can adopt lower costs. Now, then you can ask why I can adopt lower costs where he cannot. Well, I have better technology, I have better quality of labor, but the cost. Remember, price for the producers is determined by the cost. This is the cost first, okay? So whatever the price that I'm eventually able to assign, that is based on my cost. Now, of course, you can argue, well, but in reality, even if you know the price based on cost is marginal cost pricing, let's say 100, but many producers decided to assign 120. because they want to have high profit. All right, that's called markup, okay? But if there is no markup, basically your price is determined by your cost structure. And that's why in microeconomics, when they started to explain to you monopolistic competition, the cost structure is different than in perfect competition. Okay? So the answer to your question, Marshall, yes, in CG it can be done. In fact, I'm working on increasing return to scale monopolistic competition now, not in perfect competition. And that is very important for developing countries, because you know very well in many less developed countries, competition, perfect competition is far from reality. Okay, the role of the government. Think about this. Remember I said L1 is skilled labor, L3 is unskilled labor. But is the fact that there is skilled labor such and such number, and then there is non-skilled labor such and such number, is that coming from the sky, exogenous? If I'm writing this, the answer is yes, right? Because anything on the right hand side is exogenous. That means someone give me that. I have 150 skilled labor and I have 500 unskilled labor. Yeah, but why? Where is this coming from? This is not robots, right? Why this labor becomes skilled? Now, let me introduce complication here. Suppose originally you have 10 skilled and 20 unskilled. But then the next period you have 12 skilled and 18 unskilled. So there is a possibility of movement, mobility from unskilled to skilled. How? If you learn, right, training or schooling and whatever. So the next question is, how do you do the training? How do you do the schooling? Well, depending your philosophy, if you believe government has to do it, like most Democrats believe, you have to do it. So that means G, remember government G? The variable G in the final demand, G has to spend something for education. So that means this L1 is a function of G, right? So that is the dynamics of the model. So it's not just, okay, I give you this L1, L2, L3 and then see what happened to the output. No, it's affecting everything. Any question? Yeah?
Can you capture to the time?
Of course, yeah. Okay, there are two types, okay. Let me explain to you both of them, but let me say up front that the first one is the most common one, the first type, okay. What is the first type? What you do is, you shock the model several times. So let's say you have a model, let's say your model captured the year of 2000, and then you shock the model to emulate the 2001. You shock the model, emulate 2002 and so on and so forth until, let's say, the last available data is 2007 because now it's 2008, right? So you shock until 2007 and then you compare the results of your simulation and the actual number. And you apply all kinds of statistical RMSE, you know, how different is your model from the actual one. And of course you have to improve and so on until you're happy with the model. Is that clear? So that's what you do. Now once you're happy, then you have a laboratorium which allow you to do the with and without analysis, the most ideal methodology. It's no longer before and after. Because that's what you need, that's what you seek for, a laboratorium. Like in physics, in chemistry, you have a laboratorium where you can with and without, right? But now you have it. So that's one way to do it. The second way is dynamic model. Now, why the dynamic model is rarely used? Number one, because it's so difficult to convert the model. Why? Because in a dynamic model, every single variable is moving continuously, not discrete. Whereas if you shock one, it's discrete, right? Whereas in dynamic model, continuously. So that means you have to deal with integral and so forth. It's difficult. If it is small model, that's fine. That's why I always recommend, if anybody is interested to build a truly dynamic CGE, don't build a big model, only small model. You see the difference between continuous and discrete, right? Okay? Now, let me say a few words about application, because as I said, the translation of all this into GAMS, that should be done in the lab. I cannot do it here, okay? Because I have to show the language and so forth. So let me touch upon the applications of CGE model, because this is very important. Let me start by giving you an example of the mistake that most students make, okay? Especially students who are about to write dissertation. I'm assuming majority of you are in the stage of writing dissertation. They come to me and said, Prof, I'm going to write a dissertation. And then I ask, all right, what are you going to write? I'm going to write a dissertation using CGE. And I tell the students, get out. Because you don't know what you're talking about. CGE is not a topic. CGE is a model, okay? And not all topics can be solved by the CGE. So if you are going to write a model, say first what topics, what issue you're interested in. Don't tell me I'm going to write a dissertation using CGE. What are you talking about? What kind of issues you're talking about, okay? So one thing that you have to stay away from, being trapped with mathematical and computer modeling. Don't. Let me repeat what I said the very first day in this semester. I can teach this class in Chinese, in Japanese, in French, in Spanish, if I speak those languages, of course. But I can also teach this in math. So the mathematics are only language for planners and economists and social scientists. This is not the topic. Mathematics is not a topic. If you want mathematics topic, go next door. That's mathematics department. Okay? So come up with issues first, and then we discuss about, okay, how do you deal with this issue? Can you approach this issue using such and such model? That is the right approach. Okay? So with that, it's very important to understand CGE is useful for what? This model that we are going to study the rest of the semester, what is it useful for? All right, let me start with the most common one of the CGE. Usually CGE is used to analyze the effect of fiscal policy, taxation policy. In fact, the early years of CGE models, I would say 80 to 90% are applied to the taxation model. So they want to see what is the impact of, let's say, introducing new tax, or what is the impact of cutting the tax rate of value-added tax, or income tax, or corporate tax, or property tax, and so forth. So that's one classical example of CGE. And then in the 80s, you know, in 80s, many countries around the world started to liberalize their trade sectors, right? Remember GATT? Maybe you are too young to remember GATT. Now you only remember WTO, right? But GATT is one before WTO. Before it's called WTO, it was called GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So in the 80s, many countries liberalized their trade. So CGE is applied to trade analysis. What is the effect on the economy of cutting the import tariffs, for example? Or what is the impact of removing the non-tariff barriers? Because, you know, many countries, when they are showing their tariffs, apparently their tariffs are already low, but the non-tariff barriers is very high. Okay? And the impact on the tariffs and non-tariff barriers are very different. So CGE can help you to analyze what's the different impacts of liberalizing your trade sector by removing the non-tariff barriers versus reducing the tariff, import tariffs. Two different things, right? So that's the common example. And then towards the late 80s, many countries around the world, thanks to the World Bank and other international financial organizations, they adopt what they call the structural adjustment program. So all of a sudden, many analysts use CGE for structural adjustment program. I know my colleagues here at Cornell, professor in economics department, he's been using CGE extensively to analyze the structural adjustment of several countries. Okay? Because they want to know what is the impact on structural adjustment, not only on growth, on standard, variables, but also on income distribution. Who gets what? Because usually people, take for example NAFTA, people only look at, okay, the impact of NAFTA is positive for the trade in the US, but hardly people analyze, okay, who gains NAFTA and who loses from NAFTA? That's an example. So CGE can help you to analyze that. By the way, why? Why CGE can analyze this? Let me test. Because this is the 6th week, right? So 5 weeks you learn already in class. Why in CGE we can analyze the income distribution? How?
Because we still use the SAM.
Exactly, because we still use the same old friend called social accounting matrix, in which there is an institution called household, different household, poor household, medium income household, and so forth. Now, the beauty of CGE, unlike SAM, not only that you know the income of different households, but you know the prices faced by different kind of households. For example, poverty line. You know how to measure poverty, right? The World Bank measure poverty by looking at what is the poverty line, and then they look at, okay, in the country, 100 people, how many people out of 100 live below that poverty line? If 40 people, then the poverty incidence in that country is 40%. 40 divided by 100. So what does that mean? That means the determination of poverty line is very critical, right? Now, what is this poverty line? Poverty line is basically price times basic consumption. Basic means if you consume less than that, you're not living normally, okay? Either your nutrition is way below minimum requirement or whatever, okay? But no matter how you measure that minimum consumption, price is there, right? So you cannot analyze that poverty using SAM because there is no price, right? You can analyze the income distribution using SAM, but not poverty. If you analyze poverty, you have to have price. And CGE has endogenous price, and that is the reason why a lot of CGE models in the 80s, when they are applied for structural adjustment program, they look at what is the impact of structural adjustment program, not only on macro variables, but also on poverty. Okay? And then in the 80s, do you remember the World Bank started to heavily promote environment, right? CGE modelers started to use CGE for environmental analysis. In fact, today the last model I'm going to show you, to demonstrate to you, is about that, about environment. Okay? So how can we analyze, for example, the seemingly trade-off between economic objective and environmental objective? Because some people still believe that, well, if you want to improve the environment, then you have to sacrifice your economic goals, the efficiency objective and so forth. Well, the model I'm going to show today demonstrate that that's not necessarily the case. It's not always trade-off. Okay? So a lot of CGE modelers use the models to apply for environmental analysis. Okay? I think it's enough to give you an example, but if you're interested with other topics, we can discuss separately. But just to give you an idea, the range of issues that CGE can handle, is that giving you enough ideas about how CGE can be applied? Okay. So let me now move to the environmental models that I'm talking about. Here is the story. You know, one of, not the only one, but one of important goals in economics or in economic policy making or in economic planning is to maximize your growth, right? And the idea there is if you have high growth, you can do so many different things. You can spend more for municipalities, you can spend more for the state government, you can spend more for infrastructure, for school, for hospital, for anything, okay? That's the whole idea. That's one of the important economic objectives. From the environmental point of view, of course, it will be nice if you can achieve that while you are maintaining the quality of the air, for example. Okay, so if you can minimize also the pollution, the emission. Okay, so that's more or less the trade-off between this environmental objective and economic objective. So if that is the case, basically there are two different markets here. One, it's called the normal market. Let's call it normal market. That is the market as you understand it, you know, commodity markets. That's economic market. And then let's call it the non-market commodities, which is related to the environment, pollution, for example. Okay? Now, if you can see that, I know it's not that clear, but the non-market here, the goods is 1 to M, right? The non-market, which is the environment, I call it M, which is the last one. You have it all here in your handout, okay? The last one is M, right? So in other words, the standard goods market is from 1 to M minus 1. And let's call that K. So K is from 1 to M minus 1. Is that clear? Now, the utility for the market is pretty standard, like this one, you know, utility, right? You basically want to maximize the consumption. The only difference here, I'm using consumption here, excluding consumption for basic goods. I tell you the reason why. You know, every day you are consuming certain goods for you just to survive, right? Eating, drinking, and so forth, right? So that's the consumption. Let's call it A, okay? But you will either increase or reduce your utility, your satisfaction, depending on what happened with goods or your consumptions beyond that basic. Do you understand that? Let's say if you're able to see, I don't know, depending on your interest, if you like movie, for example, if you can see movie 4 times in a month, okay, maybe you are happier than if you are able to see only one movie in a month. Now, what is seeing movie has nothing to do with basic commodities, right? You will survive without seeing movie. So that means seeing movie is on top or beyond your basic consumption. So that's why it's called C minus G. So G is the minimum consumption. Is that clear? So in other words, your utility is determined by how much consumptions you can consume beyond the basic commodities, basic consumption, or I call it minimum consumption there. Okay? Now, remember, we are now introducing environmental objective. So that means the utility of the society will not only determine by how many times they can go to movie, how many times they can go to the concert, but also what happened with the air quality. So now a little bit complication, because here this is a simple economic utility, there is no environment here. But now I'm introducing a new environmental variable, because I will be happier, let's say, if I'm seeing only 3 times the movie, but with cleaner air, rather than seeing 4 or 5 times the movie, but the air is dirtier. You see what I mean? Right? So let's define now the utility related to the environment, and let's call it the difference between TNP and NP. What is TNP here? TNP is tolerable net pollution. You know, EPA, for example, they have all the science, they have all the information, and they can set what is the tolerable level. Let's say 100, okay? NP is the actual net pollution. So in other words, if the tolerable level according to EPA is 100, and then the actual pollution is 90, is that good or bad? If the tolerable level is 100 and the actual is 90, is that good or bad? Good, because that means the pollution is still, below what is the tolerable level. And that's why if that is good, your utility positive. You see that? And vice versa. Okay? Now, what is net pollution? Well, from the title, net. Net means gross minus something, right? Net pollution is the actual pollution, and I call it dirt, okay, because it's dirty, right? Dirt, okay, minus whatever is cleaned using whatever technology, and let's assume that the cleaning activity is done by the government. That's why I call it GM. You see that? So let me repeat. The actual net pollution that we are facing equals to whatever pollution generated by human activities minus whatever government clean. So if the economic system generate 1,000 particles emission, okay, and the government clean up and they're able to clean 400, that means the net pollution is 600. Is that clear? And then coming back to the utility function, if that 600 is still below the tolerable level, that's fine. You have positive utility, and vice versa, you have a negative utility. Is that clear? So that is the only difference or the only new friend that you are not familiar with, right? That's why I have to explain separately. Nit, do you have a question?
Is the F plus here?
Oh, F plus means it's a positive function. Yes. Well, it depends what kind of pollution. It can be SO2, NOx, whatever pollution. That's a detail. All right? So, here is the models basically, and you don't need to look at the economic side because it's pretty standard, similar to this basically. So, don't pay so much attention on it. What you have to pay attention is on the utility. Now, look at the utility. There are two types of utility. One is for the environment, right? The other is for economics. The economic is on the right-hand side, the CK minus GK. That's the standard utility, whereas the left-hand side is the utility for the environment. Is that clear? All right. Now, don't look at your notes now. Just listen and let's discuss here. What are we trying to do here? Remember, our main goal here is try to see whether there is a trade-off between economic or efficiency objective and environmental objective, right? That means we have to identify first representative variables for both, right? Representative variables for the economics and representative variables for the environment. Ideally, we can make these two index into composite index, which represent both. Do you understand what I mean? So there is a variables representing economic goals, there is a variable representing environmental goal. Okay, if you're given these two, that is good enough for you to analyze whether or not there is a trade-off. But isn't it nicer if someone can come up with a composite index capturing the two? Yes?
Basically, you have to figure out how to quantify environmental effects, basically like in dollars or
Correct.
in something that can relates to economic effects.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. So you have to see first of all the two variables, and then of course when I said you are given these variables, that means you are already capturing the interaction. You know, the more production, the more pollution, right? That's basically it, right? So that's what you do that. So let's concentrate on these three things. One is economic variables, the second is environmental variables, and the third is composite variables, right? So let's use, what is the economic variables? Well, the easiest one to look at is GDP. What happened with the GDP, right? That's usually economists use. What about environmental variables? Well, let's use the net worth. Because, you know, what you concern with is what happened with the quality of the air, right? What about the composite index? Hey, we have that utility, remember? That utility capture both. So let's look at these three variables. Okay? Let me show you the result because I will explain the modeling in the lab. Okay, I know you cannot see this, but you have it in front of you, okay? Now, let's look at the first one. So, we run the model. Let's think about the first run. We run the model and then we adopt the government cleaning. Remember what is net pollution? Net pollution is dirt minus government cleaning, right? So, let's play around with government cleaning. So, the first row, which is called clean, is basically representing different scenario of government cleaning. So let's start with if the government clean 980 unit, whatever it is the unit, okay? So if the government clean 980 units, what happened with the GDP? 32851. Everybody follows that? So that's the GDP that you generate if the government clean 980 unit. What happened with the utility in the society? Remember, the utility now is composite. 668, right? So in other words, if the government decided to clean 980 units of pollution, then the economy will generate GDP 32851 and the utility in the society is 668. Is that clear? Now, let's play around with a series of different government cleaning. So I started to raise the government cleaning to 995, 1010, 1025, 1040, 1055 and so on and so forth. Alright? Let's look at what happened with the GDP. What happened with the GDP as I increase the cleaning? Increasing all the way. Right? Of course. Because government cleaning is an activity, right? If the government introduce certain activity, no matter what activity it is, it will add to the GDP. Remember, Y equals to C plus G plus I. So if G increase, automatically the GDP will increase. Right? Alright, the GDP increase. But that's not our goal. Remember, our goal is to see whether there is a trade-off between environment and economic. Well, we now have the composite index. It's called the utility. What happened with the utility? Let's start from 980 to 995. What happened with the utility? Increase. Well, in that case, let's clean more. 1010. What happened with the utility? Increase. Let's clean more. 1025. What happened with the utility? Increase. 1040. Increase. 1055. Increase. 1070. Started to decrease, right? So what does that mean? See, this is the nature of trade-off. If you don't know about all this trade-off nature, you are very, very strong and even too excessive environmentalist. You will say, government clean as much as you can. But they forget cleaning requires some cost. Right? If you want to clean as much as you want, you have to sacrifice certain thing. And it turns out the sacrifice that you have to make beyond cleaning 1055 outweigh the benefit that you can get. And that's why the utility started to go down. Is that clear? So that means from 980 to 1055, there is no trade-off between achieving economic objective and achieving environmental objective. So in other words, the general statement that there is a trade-off between economics and environment, it's nonsense. It's not always the case. Yes, who started? Yes.
Professor, but even from 995 to 1010, the increase is like 0.00.
You mean small increase?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
but still increase, right?
okay.
Yeah, and it all depends on the unit here.
Okay.
All right. Remember, if you wish, this is what is considered the limitation of CGE, because CGE is not environmental models, right? It's economic models. Remember, 0.001 improvement in terms of number, it's very tiny. But if you talk about, the long-term impact on your health of cleaner environment, boy, the effect is huge. See, the problem here is that this is an economic model. CG is an economic model, but we want to incorporate environmental issues. And that's why I will not worry so much about the improvement big or not. I know that the impact of a tiny improvement in environment, in the quality of air, has a big effect on my future health, my children's future health, and things like that. Okay, so it's we haven't taken into account that kind of issues. Okay, the point here is that are there possibilities that maximizing GDP will also improving environmental quality? And we know from this exercise the answer is yes, there is, right? Another way to put it, you can continue clean the environment, but up to certain point, because the message here is that cleaning the environment is not without cost. There is a cost that you have to pay. Okay, Marshall, you want to ask?
Yeah, how do you, it's like whenever you're talking about environmental impacts, you have to compose it as put it in an index of some sort. What's the standard? How do you integrate that in the model? Because I think that's the most difficult thing.
The way I integrate, that's why I explained it earlier. Here is the way we integrate, okay? First, you have to ask the EPA. Mr. EPA or Mrs. EPA, who is now the EPA? Used to be Todd Bittman, Mrs., right? But now I don't know who. Mr. Okay, Mr. EPA, what is the national standard of net pollution, whatever it's measured, okay? So they give you, that is your TNP there. Can you see that TNP? Oh, let's go up here. Okay, here is the TNP here. That is the tolerable net pollution.
So that's quantified as it's
Quantify.
given a number.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know because I'm not expert, but let's say. And then NP is the actual outcome of pollution generated by the economic activities after the government clean. That's why it's called net, right? That's why this is net. So dirt is all the pollution generated by economic activities, and then GM is the cleaning. So that's the way you measure it. And as I said, if you agree with me, if the tolerable level according to EPA, pollution is 100, so don't go beyond 100, and then you measure the actual pollution is only 50, your utility increase, positive, because that you're happy. That means you're living in a clean environment, right? Yes?
How we know that the environmental will affect the utility, how much? It depends on how you specify the utility function.
Yeah, exactly. Look at this. Look at this here. There is beta. Look at your note. You have a note there, right?
Yeah, right.
Because this is not clear. Beta.
Yeah.
The beta, it's almost like this. That tells you how sensitive the society utility towards clean environment or clean air. Some society, maybe in a poor society, maybe they are not that sensitive to the environment, okay? because what they need is more income first. Right? But in another society is highly sensitive. So that is captured through the coefficient beta here. See?
So beta is defined exogenously in here. So it's like we want
Yeah, it depends on what country or what society you're applying the model here. Okay. Any other question? So, do you get one? I'm giving you one examples here. Now, the key which I haven't talked about so far here is that how can this model generate the dearth? Remember the dearth? I was saying earlier the dearth is nothing but the pollution generated by the economic activities. How can the model called CGE generate dearth? Several years you studied economics, you never encountered a variable called dearth, right? But how can now they generate this? That is the key. Now, the answer is that in every country, they have what they call the pollution coefficient. Let's call it PIC, PIJ, let's say. Pollution coefficient. Or PC, well, doesn't matter, PIJ. Remember the input-output tables? What is XIJ? XIJ is the amount of commodity I required by the production of 1 unit of commodity J. Remember that? So PIJ is the amount of pollution generated in sector I because sector I is demanded by sector J. That is called the pollution coefficient. So it's the same with the concept in input-output, except now instead of talking about goods being delivered, we are now talking about pollution being emitted. Isn't it wonderful now? So in other words, you are not just talking about if I have a factory and then I can calculate how much pollution emissions that my factory generates. No, that's not all. Because the presence of my factory, remember forward and backward linkage, generate another activities. And that other activities also generate pollution. So, in other words, the pollution emission that we are dealing here is also capturing the indirect and direct effect of pollution. That's the way the model captures the pollution. Okay? Now, if you pay attention on the handout, you will see something a bit complicated there. I don't mean to, to confuse you. Look at the production function, the factor markets block at the bottom. Here, at the bottom. Now, you may not be familiar with that form. Why? Because that's the most general form. It's called the VES, variable elasticity of substitution. But let me explain to you why this is so important. Yes, we can answer the question. Remember, our original question is whether or not there is a trade-off between economic objective and environmental objective. And I have shown you that we can do that, right? But actually, if you are a planner, as a planner, that's not all. Remember what is endogenous in planning model? Policy variables. All right, so what policy are you suggesting here? Okay, one clear policy is that government should clean the environment up to a certain point. All right, is that all? Because you can always change the dearth, right? How do you change the dearth? Remember, the dearth is the pollution emitted by the economic activities, economic system. How do you change the dearth? Let me ask you, suppose there are two factories in Tompkins County. One is electronic factories and the other is oil. Suppose, I know there's no oil, but let's suppose there's oil. Which one do you think is more polluting? Oil. So, as a planner, what are you suggesting here?
Improving the technology.
Improve the technology, right? What about if the source of the pollution is imported? Reduce the import. But then you have to reduce the production because your factory requires that imported goods. So how do you do that?
Find a substitution.
Wow, that's a great idea. As a planner, that's a great idea. Try to adopt some technology substituting the existing technology. You know, there's a big deals now about this power generation in the US. EPA has a new rules, right? The rule says that you have, okay, there are two types of power generating companies. One is using the old system, old technology, and one is the new technology. And then, well, I don't know exactly, but something like this. The rule says that for the new technology, they set up a standard which is different for the old technology, because the argument is it's unfair to set up a new standard for old technology, because when they started the companies, there was no new rules, right? So the new rules is only applied to the new technology and so forth. So there is a question about what kind of technology that you're going to use, right? That means substitution, right? So the adoption of variable elasticity of substitutions become very important. If you want to reduce the dirt, which is wonderful because you reduce the pollution, right? You don't, as a planner, you don't suggest Tompkins County, you reduce your economic activity. Because if you do that, automatically the dirt will go down. But that's not what you want, right? Yes, you may have a cleaner environment, but then Tompkins County economy is going doldrum. I mean, going nowhere. There's a lot of unemployment, crime rate, and so forth. That's not what you want to do. So what you can do is you reduce the dirt not by reducing the activities, but by technology substitution. How do you capture that? That's in the variable elasticity of substitution. I'll explain on Thursday on the lab, the math of it. Okay. The nice thing about VES is that if I set one of the variables, let's say rho, if I set rho equals to 1, that complicated form of production function collapse into Cobb-Douglas. Isn't it nice? Whereas if you use Cobb-Douglas and I give you, all right, the elasticity of substitution is 0.35, you cannot capture it. Because Cobb-Douglas implicit assumption is that elasticity of substitution equals to 1, right? Cannot be otherwise. And that's why it's nice to have the more general production function, because you want to deal with this kind of technology substitution here. Question? Now, let's look at the next table here. Okay, it's all you have, so you don't have to look at the screen because you have it. Okay, the title is Table A1. All right. Now look at that. It's not only that the model generates numbers that allows you to decide what is the optimum level of the cleaning, the government cleaning, but the models also give you what happened with the prices of different sectors. Notice that the prices are all changing, right? For each of the government cleaning level, the prices are all changing. Let's start with sector 1. What sector 1 is, by the way, is agriculture sector. So let's see what happened with the price in the agriculture sector. Is it increasing or decreasing? Increasing. Let's now move to sector 11. What happened with the price at sector 11? Decreasing. Aha. Now, let me ask you, if the price of sector 1 increased, the price of sector 11 decreased, what do you think happened with the consumption of sector 1 and consumption of sector 11? Decrease? And then? Increase. So, what is going on there? There is a change in consumption pattern, right? So, as a planner, be careful. If you are suggesting something, in this case you are suggesting government clean up to a certain point, you have to also accept the consequence that there is a change in the consumption pattern. And why we can do this? Because there is a consumption block under different households. Now, remember the SAM? Boom, 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 boom. After you know the consumption, what happened? What is the next after you know the consumption pattern? Production. So, what do you expect here? The production. See, consumption sector 1 goes down, consumption sector 11 goes up. What do you think happened with the production? Well, let's move to table the next one. Oh, not the production, sorry, the consumption. That's table 7.3. That's the consumption. Right? So, the point here is that thanks to the endogenous price, we can generate different patterns of consumption, different patterns of production. These are all generated by changing prices. And changing prices are completely impossible to generate up to last week. Because when we talk about SAM, when we talk about input-output, when we talk about SPA, I know you are now all expert. I know when you wake up in the morning, you think about SAM now. But even with that kind of expertise, you cannot generate the price changes. That is the weakness of SPA and SAM. By the way, having said the weakness, it doesn't mean that you can throw that out, okay? That models. But I want you to be aware that the models that you learned up to last week, how powerful it is, but still it carries a weakness, and the weakness is it treats prices exogenous. It does not allow price to change. And the problem with that is that you cannot predict what happened with the consumption patterns behavior. You cannot predict what happened with the production behavior, right? Yes?
I see that there is some scenario in here like there is a pollution tax with pollution tax and without pollution tax.
Good.
The question is how we can come up with the best policy, how we can read this, to sign that this is the best policy.
All right, good. That's a good question. Okay, the first question is, do we need to apply pollution tax? Remember, you are a planner here. And remember, so far up to this very second, what you can do is suggest the government clean up to this point, right? And then you know what happened with the consumption pattern and so on. Suppose I'm the government and I'll argue with you. Why should I increase my activities of cleaning? Why don't you recommend me to do something which can change the production behavior of the society in such that the pollution will decline? Example being tax. Why don't you recommend me, the government, to adopt pollution tax? Theoretically, if you adopt pollution tax, I get more income, you change your behavior, ideally at least, yeah. Ideally you will change your production behavior in such that you will produce something by minimizing the pollution emission. Because the more pollution emitted, the more you pay tax. Win-win solution, right? That's the first question though, that's not all. The next question is, all right, how much? How much tax you have to assign? So that is the questions of optimum tax. Remember when I said when the CGE was first used in the 70s, most of the applications are on taxation. This is an example, optimum taxation. What is the optimal level of tax? All right? So, in fact, these models can show you that. So, let's move to table A2. Everybody in table A2? Now, let's do exactly the same. When I clean 980, what is the utility? 679, right? When I clean 995, what happened with the utility? Increase or decrease? Increase. When I clean 1010, what happened with the utility? Decrease. Aha, now, since you are allowing me or suggesting me to adopt pollution tax, now I don't need to clean up to 1010. Remember before pollution tax, I have to clean 1010. Now I enough to clean up to 995. I will already achieve maximum utility. And remember, the utility here is already composite. Utility in terms of economic, commodities, and environmental quality. So, this makes sense, right? If the society pay pollution tax, the government needs to clean less amount of pollution. That makes sense, right? But still, you are having the second question. All right, how much the tax? What is the tax, right? Now, if you want to know how much the tax, you go to the next. It's in table 7.5. All right? If you go to table 7.5, look at the bottom, it's called pollution tax. Aha, it turns out that for each sector, you adopt different pollution tax. And since you want the 995, remember 995 gave you the optimum one, so you just look the column 995. For sector number 1, 173,959. For sector 2, blah, blah, blah. See, your job or your task as a planner does not stop at suggesting the government you have to clean such amount. But you are also to suggest, why don't you use policy instrument which is called tax, pollution tax, right? And your next job is, all right, if the government said agree, pollution tax, but how much I have to assign? Do I have to assign pollution tax across the board the same? And the model tells you, no, it's not the same. For different sector, different pollution tax. Okay? So, that means this pollution tax is what? Endogenous or exogenous? Endogenously determined by the model. So, that is another strength of the CGE model. It can help the government to determine what is the optimum pollution tax. Now, I don't have to spell it out, but you can imagine there's a lot of programming here, right? There's a lot of computer programming. I'm showing you only the results, numerical examples. That's why please come on Thursday. And as I said, you are going to learn a new language. But instead of going to the linguistic department there at Cornell, you go to the lab, because the language that we are going to learn is completely new language. And I know at least two of you I know, but correct me if I'm wrong, at least two of you in the class are familiar with this language, GAMS, so I need your help. Inka and Maria, I think, right? You're familiar with GAMS. So please help during the lab, because I may have to go in and out. So please help if other students have questions about the language, GAMS. All right? All right, so we'll see you at, is it 9 o'clock on Thursday? All right.